Hey, nowhere are American rights being destroyed, probably more so than with the use of federal forfeiture laws. Because under these forfeiture laws, there's no due process at all, despite the constitutional guarantees in the Bill of Rights to due process that Americans cannot be deprived of property without due process, meaning a hearing. The government routinely seizes property now using these forfeiture laws, even though the owners of the property have done nothing wrong, and even though there's no proof that they've done anything wrong, the government seizes property anyway. And it's created a lot of corruption now because a lot of the local police departments, they need money. They're having a hard time. They got budget deficits, and they have a real incentive to go out and steal things to make up the difference. And that's what's going on. And joining the program now is Eapen Thampy. He is the executive director of Americans for Forfeiture Reform. Eapen, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show.
Glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Sure. So when did your organization get going? And, how effective can you be? Because so far, as far as I can see, there's, this stuff has continued and nobody seems to challenge the obvious unconstitutionality of what the government is doing.
Yeah, well, my organization is pretty young. We organized amongst ourselves about 2 years ago. And yeah, there's not a lot of people who challenge the government's unconstitutional taking of money and property. We're glad to work with one of the few institutions that do. You may be aware of the Institute for Justice. They're a national nonprofit litigation firm that does litigate on a lot of these economic and property rights issues. So they're active on that battle, and we're glad to be involved with many of the issues and working with them to find justice for people.
But the stuff that actually goes on, I mean, I've read articles about, let's say, the owner of a hotel. It turns out that in one of the rooms in the hotel, there was a drug deal. And so because of that, the government seizes the guy's hotel. I mean, how's the guy supposed to know that there's drugs? What is he supposed to put a hidden camera in there? Because if he does that, he's going to be sued for invasion of privacy. I mean, if you rent a hotel room to somebody, you don't know what they're doing in that room. If they sell drugs, yet the government's going to seize an entire hotel based on a little teeny drug transaction in one of the rooms?
Yeah, that's basically exactly what's happening. The motel seizure you're referring to is the Motel Caswell in Tewksbury, Massachusetts. And the scary thing about this entire deal is that this property is being seized by the federal government because the DEA has an officer whose full-time job it is to look at old crime records and find properties where they have multiple calls to over time for drug violations, so they can look at the property and seize the property. So they essentially have someone who goes through old crime records and say, hey, this property in 5 years, in 10 years, there was the cops called here for drug violations 1 time, 2 times, maybe 10 times. So it means it's a problem property. That means we can go ahead and take it. That's literally the justification.
And that's got to be particularly problematic for people who live, let's say, in lower income or more minority communities where there's more likely to be drug trafficking. And so it's going to impact owners of smaller hotels in those areas. But I mean, where is the civil rights? Where are people coming out? Because, again, how can the hotel or motel owner be held responsible for what is happening behind a closed door in a motel room? I mean, you can't know. I mean, unless you're turning a blind eye to what's obvious, like there's a guy standing in the parking lot with a big sign, buy your heroin here, come to room 24B. I mean, other than that, how else are you supposed to know?
Well, in this case, the Hotel Caswell was a place where, yeah, sure, once in a while people did do drug transactions or whatever, but the reason why police was called was because the property owner was once in a while aware of these transactions and called the police. He didn't want his motel to become a problem area. So when he was aware of problems, he called the police, and that's why he has crime reports with his hotel property on it, because when he actually saw bad things happen or saw crimes happen and he involved law enforcement, he created a record. And now the DEA is looking at those records, putting it together, saying his property is that he was responsible enough and called law enforcement on criminals when he knew of their existence.
So, in other words, he tried to help. He tried to inform the authorities of what was going on, and as a result of his good citizenship, he had his property stolen. Had he just kept it quiet and allowed all the drug transactions, he'd still own his hotel.
Yeah.
Now, is it just drugs? Can they seize a hotel or a motel because of prostitution? Because if that's the case, they can seize a lot of hotels, right?
Well, they can, the forfeiture laws now let the federal government take property for a variety of reasons. And sure, in 1984 and 1986, Congress expanded those laws to include a lot of drug trafficking offenses. So if they suspect you of drug trafficking in any respect, they can initiate these forfeiture proceedings. But the crazy things about the forfeiture laws is that they've expanded beyond what we normally think of just drug law enforcement. They now allow federal agencies of all kinds to seize property. So now you have federal agencies that have regulatory missions that have nothing to do with drugs, and they have vast powers of asset forfeiture.
But even in drugs, I've read stories about, where somebody loans their car to a friend, and they get stopped, and there's a joint in the car, and they seize the car. And now they've, just because the person they loaned the car to was smoking pot, now the person who owned the car, who might have had no idea that their friend had a joint in the car, now they've lost their automobile.
Yeah, this happens all the time, and in some states they can trigger forfeiture of a vehicle for suspicion of, just if they say that they smell marijuana, they don't or any kind of drug. They don't have to find contraband. They don't have to prove a crime. They don't even have to arrest people for a crime. A recent Inspector General study found that the DEA, 65% of adopted forfeiture petitions at the DEA approved. That is, these are forfeitures that the DEA is getting from state and local law enforcement. 65% of these forfeitures involve no felony arrest, no warrant, and no finding of contraband, which essentially means the DEA is just straight robbing people. If there was no arrest, there was no contraband.
And how is this possible when we have a Constitution that says that no American citizen shall be deprived of property but with due process of law? Due process was understood to mean a hearing before a judge where evidence is presented that there's been some kind of a crime or that somebody owes the government some money. Under what definition? I mean, maybe Attila the Hun would consider this due process, but under what definition could a civilized society, supposedly one with a constitution and self limited government, how could any society like that say that what this is doing, just seizing stuff, for that's due process?
Well, it's not. Well, the civil forfeiture laws have been around for a very long time. They're actually based out of medieval English common law, where the king had the authority to seize property to create revenue for his law enforcement.
Yeah, well, last I checked, we don't have a king. I mean, maybe Obama fancies himself a king, but he's not, right? He's only the president, and so it does. So what a medieval king had the authority to do? How does that have any relation to what our government could do?
Well, it's funny because our Constitution was actually written by people who knew exactly what this kind of laws did. John Adams, who is credited with much of the intellectual authorship behind the Fourth Amendment, actually defended many Boston citizens against unfair takings exactly like this under these kinds of laws for the Revolution. These kinds of takings really inflamed the city of Boston because the king would let his law enforcement officers kick in doors, seize property with no evidence of wrongdoing without having to prove any kind of guilt in a court. And and especially, colonists back then didn't get the right to trial by jury. So the people who wrote the Constitution, who created this country, were very aware of this kind of these kind of laws.
And the ability for corruption. I mean, let's assume that I'm a police department or federal police, and there's just some guy I don't like, or he's got some property that I really want to seize. All I got to do is plant some drugs there, and or again, you're saying I don't even have to plant them. Just claim that I smelled some marijuana from the property, and now I could just take it.
Yes. And actually, this is a authority specifically that has just been granted to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And here's a little background. For decades, the Drug Enforcement Administration has been allowed to seize cash on the basis of suspecting drug trafficking. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms hasn't had that specific power, but until about last month. So now, Bureau of ATF has this amazing new forfeiture power that lets them seize property if they suspect a violation of the drug laws. They don't have to prove that; they just have to suspect a violation, and they can seize property.
Yeah, and then I suppose what happens is if your property is seized, now you've got to go to court. You're the moving party, and you've got to prove that you're innocent. You've got to prove that the property wasn't used in a drug crime, and so it shifts the burden of proof. And the whole thing is a travesty of due process. We'll continue this discussion when we get back. Stick around.
The Peter Schiff Show.
9 out of 10 historians agree. If Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine were alive today, both would be Schiff Radio Premium members.
Somewhere up there, Thomas Jefferson is looking down with great pride.
Schiff Radio continues right now.
We are talking with Eapen Thampy about the travesty of justice and the affront to constitutional due process that are the federal forfeiture laws. And Eapen, let me give you a scenario just to show how this whole process works. So let's say that I'm a homeowner and I decide to go out for the evening, and so I hire a babysitter to come by and take care of my kids. And while the babysitter is there, unbeknownst to me, she lights up a joint that she brought into my house, and somehow, let's say a federal agent is driving by, smells the marijuana, or maybe there's a little bit of a ruckus. Maybe she's invited a friend over, and they're getting a little too loud because they're smoking pot. And they get busted, and they decide to seize my house, right? First of all, when they seize the house, do they get all the contents in the house? Do they get my television sets? Do they get my computers? Or do they just get the house?
They can seize whatever they want. They can seize the entire place.
Okay, so they get everything that I own. Even if I got a safe in my bedroom that's full of jewelry, they get all of my possessions because somebody was caught smoking pot in my house.
Yeah, if they want to do that, if they really want to do that, they can do that.
Okay, now let me finish up. So let's assume that I now sue to get my house and all my worldly possessions back, assuming that I still have the money to do this, even though I've got no place to live because I got to rent a hotel for my wife and my kids. I don't have any of my clothing. I have nothing because it was all in the house and they took it all. If I sue to get it back, what if the government, puts on the babysitter and other witnesses and they prove that, in fact, pot was being smoked in my house, right? Does that mean that I don't get my house back? Or, do they have to prove that I knew about the pot and didn't care? Or is the mere fact that they establish that there was pot being smoked in my house, am I just SOL?
Well, that depends. The federal courts... on what the federal courts say. Sometimes you might get a judge that accepts your arguments and is sympathetic, but if the government really wants to contest it and really wants to make you sweat, they will, and there's very little you can do about it.
And this is supposedly America. The government can come in and take everything that I own. Hey, what does the government do? Do you have an example where things have been seized, I mean, do the government agents get to use the stuff for themselves, or do they have to sell it all, and where do they put it up on eBay, or do they have special auctions? I mean, where do you buy all the stolen loot, and who gets the money?
Well, at the federal level, the United States Marshal Service is responsible for auctioning off seized property, and they auction off hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property a year. They have an online website that tells about some of these auctions. And the money, yes, is kept by law enforcement. It's kept by federal agencies. And this is a very scary thing because this money is now free from congressional appropriation. It means it's money that a legislature is not giving the executive branch. So the executive branch has this way of funding itself that has been completely disconnected from any mechanism of democratic accountability.
Not only do they steal, right? Not only do they steal the property, but then they fence it, right? It's a giant, criminal organization from top to bottom. Yet it happens in the light of day under the color of law. These federal criminals are protected, right? I guess by judges who know nothing about the Constitution. Because after all, if we had any decent federal judges, then none of this would happen.
Yeah, you're right. The federal judiciary is an excellent example of where regulatory capture has really inserted a lot of problems into the judicial system, and in no place is it more obvious or more systemic or more harmful than in this system where the government can systematically wage war against people who have money and property, bankrupt them, and destroy them of their rights. All for the benefit of these large corporate entities that call themselves government agencies and have these powers.
Hey, how about this? What if the government catches somebody smoking pot in the basement of a bank? Can they not only seize the bank and all the property, but all the money on deposit in that bank? Can they take all the money from all the depositors in the bank and just could they do that?
In Eugene, Oregon last week, we heard about a forfeiture where the local government came in and raided a medical marijuana dispensary. And not only did they empty the register of the medical marijuana dispensary, they also want the $60,000 that was in the ATM.
In the ATM machine.
Taking the money from the ATM, you might as well go ahead to the bank and just take all the bank's money as well. At least my way.
So somebody put an ATM machine there, and now they lost all the cash that was inside that ATM machine.
Yeah.
Yeah. How can anybody think? How can anybody think that we're living in a free country if the government is free to do that? I mean, how are you free if the government can take whatever it wants from you? They can basically beat you up. I mean, what do we have a government for? The government is supposedly there to protect us from thieves. But the government are the thieves. The government probably steals more with the forfeiture laws than all the regular criminals combined. Would you say that's probably an accurate statement?
Well, the government certainly does profit massively from all kinds of enforcement. They got $500 million in a forfeiture penalty last year from Google. Google had been showing ads from Canadian pharmacies to United States consumers. That was apparently a violation of federal law. So the Department of Justice assessed a $500 million forfeiture penalty against Google.
I mean, these penalties are outrageous too. Would probably constitute, an unreasonable, cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, like if let's say a guy's got $1 million house and it's seized because of a joint that was smoked. I mean, this is petty stuff. The penalty for smoking pot this is not $1 million, yet it can be $1 million. It can be more than $1 million depending on what they seize. They shouldn't be able to impose penalties that are far greater than what the statutes impose simply by seizing stuff that they claim was involved somehow in the crime.
I agree with you, and in fact, this is one of the few places where the Supreme Court has really enforced constitutional principles in terms of the Eighth Amendment's protection against unusual or exceptional punishments. the Supreme Court has ruled that the forfeiture should be proportional to the crime. The problem is that the legal process is so convoluted and so weighted against anyone who's claiming their property that it's hard to make those claims. It's hard to challenge the forfeiture.
Well, especially when the person
find an attorney.
Yeah, especially when the person whose property was seized wasn't even involved in the crime, had no criminal behavior whatsoever. He's being punished for what somebody else did. He's not even being punished for what he did. Anyway, hey, Eapen, thanks a lot for coming on the show. I wish you luck. I wish your organization luck. Anyway, I'll try to give your website. I forgot about that. I'll give it out at the top of the next hour. Everybody else, don't forget, I got Fox Business coming up. We got another hour of the Peter Schiff Show, so stick around.